What's going on, guys? Today I wanted to bring you another discussion video on a H.A.T format tech card and talk about, do I think if this card is a gimmick or a potential game-breaking tech card. So the card I want to discuss in this video is Magic Drain. This is a very interesting card, and I think this warrants a very in-depth discussion. And if you've never seen this card before, I will quickly go over what it does. It is a counter trap card. This is a slightly older copy, so if the wording sounds a bit old school, it's for that reason. But what this card does is you can activate it when your opponent activates a spell card, and then your opponent has the option to discard a spell card, and if they do, this card's effect is negated, but if not, their spell card is negated, and you destroy that card. So I think from initial thoughts, this is a very interesting card. And the reason it is because it's sort of, in a sense, like a wiretap, minus the fact this won't shuffle the card into deck, but it is very interesting because there's not a lot of cards in H.A.T format that specifically negate spell cards. And I think that's very interesting because H.A.T format is known to have some very powerful spell cards, as well as having some very useful cards for the slower decks and for more combo heavy decks. So I think the easiest way to start this discussion is just to talk about some of the pros and cons of this card. Now, first off, where you would play this, whether it's in the main deck or the side deck, that is completely up to the player. I think in slower decks, for example, like H.A.T, Cat, Geargia, certain decks like that could probably consider maining something like this, simply because they're already used to playing a slower, grindier game, and some of those spell cards being able to stop your opponent from their consistency or making some of those big pushes is going to be more relevant in a slower deck versus a more combo heavy deck that usually will be able to just keep playing through, and obviously they aren't going to want to play a lot of trap cards or anything. And if you're going to choose to side a card like this, I think it's important to, one, know the matchup that it would be good against, but also it's probably better to side trap cards when going first. So if this were to be a main deck card, I would probably side this out if I know I'm going second, or if I were to know that I'm going first, this might be a better option. So starting off though, I think just talking about some of the cards that this can hit. So keep in mind, when your opponent activates a spell card, if they need that spell card to go through, they're going to have to discard an additional spell card. So when I talk about these cards, think of, would you consider discarding an additional spell to get that effect through, or are you just going to take the loss on that? So some of the commonly played spell cards in the format that you'll probably see are stuff like Pot of Duality. So keep in mind, your opponent would activate Pot of Duality, you would activate Magic Drain, and they would have to discard an additional spell or they won't get this effect. In a lot of decks, for example, against H.A.T, they're playing a lot of monsters and traps and not that many spell cards. So in most cases, it would be discarded. And this being a counter trap means your opponent can't even chain things like Double Cyclone or Ignition to this card's effect. So it becomes, do they want the potential resource off of the duality? But even then, they're going -1. Another card, Fire Formation Tenki, for any of those decks that are playing Fire Fist engines or Bujins. Are you willing to discard an additional spell to get your search? Powerful cards like Soul Charge, which, you know, a lot of decks, their last ditch effort in a top deck war. This card's great in a top deck war if you have the advantage already, because if your opponent drops a Soul Charge, they're going to need an additional spell in hand, which again, things like Geargia, they're only playing so many spells, usually something along the lines of Soul Charge, Upstarts, maybe MSTs. So in most cases, this is going to negate the spell card. Besides that, other cards, Dark Hole, they're having to discard an additional spell to wipe the board, which that doesn't sound that bad, but again, it really just depends. Cards like Instant Fusion, not only are you paying 1,000 life points, but you're also discarding a spell to get that extender. Same with Soul Charge, you're gonna have to discard a spell and still pay the life on top of it. So this card can make the kind of choice very difficult. Even in situations where your opponent has to beat over one of your monsters and say damage step is activating something like a Forbidden Lance, it comes up where now, in order to get over it, you're not only getting rid of the one card you're activating, but an additional card. And if not, the card is being negated. So right off the bat, being able to negate a spell card with this feels very good, and having your opponent have to discard a card. But where would this sort of not feel as good? For example, if you put this in against spellbooks, sure, it could hit one of those cards, but there's a high chance that they could also just discard a spell. Same with Dragon Ruler type decks. Sure, you could hit a Soul Charge against them or something, but they usually play a high count of spells, so sometimes they're more willing to discard an extra card because whether it's a dead trade-in or something like that, the option is there. Now, in trade-in, if they don't have another spell, they're basically activating trade-in, discarding the card for trade-in, and then having to discard an additional spell just to get it through. So technically this can even make them go -2, which is pretty crazy to think about. Now, some of the cards that it doesn't feel as good against are things like if you flip this and your opponent has the wiretap, then it goes back to that 1-for-1 type of thing. If your opponent activates an MST on one of your back row, obviously it's still a 1-for-1. They're probably not going to discard a spell. Another case is something like Ignition, which obviously if they want it to go through, they will, but usually them getting this negated and destroyed means they will get the second effect of Ignition to skip the next battle phase, so that's kind of a downside as well. And again, certain decks don't play that many spells, like Geargia, for example, or even H.A.T. To an extent, they're mostly just playing back row removal, so having that negated, it still kind of did its job and got rid of one card you have. So this card can have the potential to be a dead card against some of those grindier decks that don't care as much about having their spells negated, but I think as a whole, this does have a place in the format. I currently don't know where, though. Do I see this being a staple? Not really. Do I see it being a potential side deck option? Yeah, I think in the right deck, this has that potential, and it's a very cool card that I think needs some more exploring to be done with it. I've been testing it in a couple different decks, and it's kind of 50-50 right now, but I would love to hear your guys' opinion. Do you think this card has a place in the format? Sure, there's tons of other side deck cards as well. For example, even just a simple MST kind of gets rid of an opponent's card, but it has a cool place in the format. Like I said, I just currently myself don't know where. Speaking of MST, one other cool thing, this can be good in decks where you're going, like say in deciding, if you're playing floodgates and stuff, and you know your opponent's going to put in MSTs and things to actually hit your back row, this can kind of force your opponent to have to discard an additional card as well, just to be able to pop that floodgate. So I think that's also a kind of cool use for that. But again, let me know in the comments section your opinion on this card. Let's have a bit of a discussion, no hate in the comments section. It's all just theory and stuff. But anyways, if you guys enjoyed this video, please leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell to get notified anytime I put a new video out. Share this video with your friends, maybe they want to discuss it too. And check out my last version of the Gimmick or game-breaking hat format tech. If I remember, I'll have it linked in the description, but if not, just click on my videos on my channel, scroll through, find it, and it was another great discussion. But anyways, guys, I will see you in the next video.